Well, welcome to week number 3 in our series, Stewardship Simplified. Really glad you're here. This is a 4-week series, and as a preview for next week, just want to let you know our elders will be kind of joining me for some collective teaching. We'll do some Q&A with you. We'll each be sharing some of our own giving stories and how things along our stewardship journey. So it'll be a lot of fun next week as we kind of bring our church's other pastors up here to join me for that time. But today is week 3, and so we're going to dive into this 3rd week. Today's also Sanctity of Life Sunday. And I didn't necessarily plan for these to intersect like they do, but they have, and I'm very thankful. And so to help us think about stewarding our children and valuing life and being unashamed for the sanctity of life from the womb all the way to the tomb, there's some folks joining us today as guests to help us think about this and to take action in some ways. They're out in the lobby area, the cafe area. One is Alpha Women's Center. It's our local pregnancy center here in Ankeny. I've been a partner of theirs for years, love what they do. In fact, if you checked a child in this morning at our children's ministry, you may have received a baby bottle. And so we're just asking that, as we do every year, fill the bottle up with change or checks. Both work. And it's one of the ways we help continually to financially help the Alpha Women's Center. So that'll be out there as well. And then, of course, the Agape Pregnancy Resource Center located in Des Moines. Their director goes here to church, Leanna, does a fabulous job, a wonderful ministry there. They're joining us today as well. And then a new one that you may not have heard of, LifeWise. They do some innovative work within our public schools in regards to teaching the Bible, but it's not on site, and yet it's perfectly, can I use the word legal? I'm not even sure if that's the right word they would use, but one of our members, several of our members are on the board there. One of our members is repping them today. He's out there, Jeff, and so he'll be at that table. I'd encourage you, just check into those 3 ministries. All of them are aimed at helping our children, helping our families raise children correctly, and so I'd encourage you to stop by those tables and learn more about them. You know, each of them have a special way of helping us value children. Because without question, children matter. And we're, as parents, their stewards. Now, that doesn't replace your role as a parent. Don't hear steward and parent as conflicting, but rather the word steward gives us insight into the kind of parent we are. We are not an owning parent. We're a managing parent. We're a stewarding parent. God gives us children. He's gifted them to us. They're a treasure, the Bible says, and we have the joy of raising them to release them for God's purposes. So that time period in which you manage or steward your children, you're doing that because they belong to God and He's entrusted them to you for a while. So I'll say this again, it's been one of the more helpful thoughts that I've had in the series, that we live like we own them, but we know that we don't. And that's true for all of our resources. If you live like you don't own something, you won't be a very good steward. You won't be a good manager. So you've got to almost have the mentality like, hey, I've got to live like I own this because I'll give an account for it. I'm responsible for it. But yet you mentally, factually know I don't own them. Everything is God's. And so it's this conflicting sense in one way. And yet, can we just admit this? All of us hold conflicting ideas all the time in the same hands. This is one of those moments. You've got to admit and realize you don't own this, and yet you need to live like you do. That's the essence of being a good steward. And today we're going to see that really we're stewarding our children as well. One of the ways that Julie and I helped set this into our mind was that every time she gave birth to one of our children, right there in the hospital, I would just say, hey, can we pause for a moment? I mean, this is seconds after they're born. The doctor's even still there. The nurses, the team is there. And pretty much within at least the first minute, I would just say, hey, can we just all pause for a minute and thank the Lord for this gift and give our child back to God? We'd say those words. Now, I don't think you have to do that. It's not a sin if you don't. There's not a verse that says you have to do that in that way, all right? That's how we chose to do it, so relax a little bit. You may think it's a little aggressive, a little, intense. I'll tell you this, if you want to stop a medical team in their tracks, just say, I'm going to pray. Even doctors will say, okay, and they just pause right there in the moment. And so we would. Julie's holding the baby, and this is sometimes even before the cord's cut. And we just would say, God, thank you for this gift of a child. And we're going to do the best we can to raise them, and they're yours in the end. So that's what happened. I would encourage you to find something in your family that would commemorate, remember, symbolize, motivate you to remember you're just a steward of this child. You are the parent, but that means you're a managing parent, and God owns them, and you'll release them one day for His purposes. Now, as we think about managing parents, stewarding parents, is there a place in the Bible that tells us more about how to do this? There is. So locate Psalm 127, would you? Because in Psalm 127, we have what may be a beautiful, poetic picture of the stewarding parent, the managing parent, the parent that knows these kids don't belong to me, and yet I'm going to act like they do. Psalm 127. As you turn there, 3 words I want you to keep in mind today that will kind of describe our time together. I want to first of all just summarize the chapter. Can you say the word summarize? Then I want to contextualize it. Say the word contextualize. And then I want to personalize it. Personalize, say that. So 3 words, say them with me. Summarize, contextualize, personalize. We're going to take that trip through this psalm. Most of it's going to be in the middle section. Let me give you a summary as you're finding Psalm 127. You're probably there, but Psalm 127 really covers 3 areas of what I would call activity. Say the word with me, activity. It covers the area of the house, the city, and then, of course, the family, represented by the word sons. You'll see this in the text in a minute. And here's what's interesting. Each of these areas or activities, if you read the psalm, it seems to have connected to it some potential anxiety. And this is why the psalm affirms that all of these things mentioned are from the Lord, that you're not to do this without Him, otherwise you're doing it in vain. The sense is like you're going to struggle, you're going to really toil to no end. It's a futile effort if you leave the Lord out of this. Whether it's building a house or protecting a city or trying to sleep while you're raising kids. I need the Lord in all of these. And so what he shows us is that the Lord's ownership of all of these is the antidote to the anxiety that can come in these activities. In short, this psalm lays out for us how God owns all of these. He builds the house. He protects the city. He gives sleep. And as the text lays out, He gives offspring. So the idea of stewardship is clearly embedded in this psalm. We're managers, and as verses 3 to 5 will lay out, specifically of our family. We steward that responsibility under God's authority. We are dependent upon Him. We can't build a house, protect a city, or raise children effectively without God. And so we're going to see this as this chapter unfolds in all 3 of these activities or arenas, whether it be, say with me, whether it be a house or a city or a family, that really we're generational managers. That's the very first part of our take-home truth today. I want to get that out to you in the summary section because I want you to kind of watch this unfold. In fact, will you say these 4 words with me? Stewards are generational managers. Can we retry our quiz from the last 2 weeks? Last week we saw that stewards are what type of manager? Gracious manager. That guy gets an A right there. He went home and studied this week, didn't he? I love it. And the first week we saw that stewards are what? faithful managers. Man, we're passing with flying colors today. Fantastic. We're going to see today that stewards are generational managers. Let's read the text. Psalm 127, 5 verses in this poem. It's in 2 sections. Solomon says this to us: unless the Lord builds a house, its builders labor over it in vain. Unless the Lord watches over a city, the watchman stays alert in vain. In vain you get up early and you stay up late, working hard to have enough food. Yes, he gives sleep to the one he loves. What a beautiful contrast, isn't it? He's not here diminishing work or getting up early or getting up late. He's saying without the Lord, those things are futile. Meaning, who actually owns even the sleep that we get? It's God. He owns the food that we receive. He owns the work that we do, our schedules. All of these things must come from God, and we must see them that way. Otherwise, it's just in vain. Verse 3, sons are indeed a heritage from the Lord. Offspring, or more literally there, the fruit of the womb, a reward. Don't you wish our culture saw children that way? This is Sanctity of Life Sunday, you know. And I didn't intentionally plan for all these things to converge on this week, but it's beautiful that it did. Here, children are a heritage or a treasure. They're a reward. They're like arrows, verse 4 says, in the hand of a warrior. These are the sons born in one's youth. And happy is the man who has filled his quiver with them. We like the end of that verse where you have a quiver full, but can I remind you that a quiver full is also a handful? Would you agree? The verse says here, they will never be put to shame, speaking of the children, when they speak with their enemies at the city gate. Beautiful chapter, a poem and yet a song that describes for us really a lot about being a stewarding or managing parent. Let me contextualize this a bit for you. I think we'll get the most out of this psalm if we let it sit within its context and let it speak the way it's written, not try to twist it to match our culture or our setting. Okay? There are 3 principal areas defined in this psalm. I've said them to you before. I'll say them again to you. It's the house, it's the city, and it's these sons. I think we're safe to use the word family there. But for the sake of contextualization, let me just stay true to the text. When he speaks of house here, he's probably speaking of the house of the Lord, or I would rather say to you, the temple. Now, I would be comfortable textually transferring that in today's culture by saying God's people. You could say the church. But either way, I don't think the first use of the word house here is referring to your house. I think that comes in the word sons. He's here referring, I think he does this also in Psalm 122 and Psalm 134. When he says the word house, he's referring to the house of God's people, that spiritual community. Now, let me give you some further proof of this. Psalm 127 is embedded in a section of Psalms known as the Psalms of Ascent. It's the Psalms or the songs that the children of Israel in individual families would recite or sing as they made their way annually to the temple. So it makes sense that as they're trekking, as they're pilgrimaging to the temple together with themselves and other families, no doubt thousands of people, they're thinking about the house of the Lord, and they're singing songs and reciting these kinds of poems that remind them of these things. Their heritage, their identity, much about their culture was embedded in these psalms that they would recite. There's about 15 or so of them. And so this is why I think when he says the word house here, he's referring more than likely to the house of the Lord, the temple, where the spiritual community lived and related. There may be a reference where this is referring to David's line, his lineage perhaps, but I'm very content that he's speaking here of the spiritual community of God's people. So if you want to transfer this to the here and now, I think you'd be textually safe to apply it by saying God's people in the church now. When he says the word city, he's referring to Jerusalem. That's where the temple was. It's the city in which they lived. And when he refers to sons, I think he's referring to David's sons. Solomon here is probably referring to himself as one of David's sons. He's thinking of the continuation of the throne through him, and of course then through his sons. You see this in Psalm 132 as well. If you're wondering, did Solomon write this song? There's a subtle pointer to that fact at the end of verse 2. You won't see this in your English translation. So you'll need to trust me on this. Most commentaries bear this out, so I'm not the first guy to think of this, all right? But at the end of verse 2, it says, he gives sleep to the one he loves or to those he loves. That's actually the word beloved. It's actually the transliteration, if we can call it, or at least the translation of the name Jedediah. Jedediah in 2 Samuel is the name that God gave to Solomon. So is Solomon here saying, you can work like crazy and schedule your life both early and late. You can fret and stress, but then at the end of the day, it's God who gives his beloved sleep. Is he thinking of his own life here? You know, he was the one who built the temple. God told David, you're a man of war. It won't be for you. It'll be for Solomon. In fact, many look at David as Israel's greatest king, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But the kingdom had the most vast influence under Solomon. Solomon was really the one who made Jerusalem globally famous, built the temple. And so here he's just simply saying, that's the result of, in this case, sons. They carry on the name. They carry on the work. And so when you read the psalm in light of these terms, historically, we could use the word what? Contextually. Understanding what the writer meant in that culture at that time. If that's the setting, then this really does make a lot of sense. But it gives sense not only to what he's meaning when you think about sons and offspring and city and house. I'm convinced it gives even more weight to why it's written the way it's written. In other words, the order of the psalm. Because if you just read it and you're not aware of its context or its historical nature, you may just kind of think they're just three topics he picked out of the sky. Let's talk about cities, let's talk about houses or temples or spiritual communities, and let's talk about kids. But there's a reason he talked about kids last. It's this, that if David has no sons, the kingdom stops. This is a very Jewish understanding, isn't it? Everything was based on your name, and so it passed down in that way, the lineage. This is why there was such an appreciation for sons. And furthermore, the more sons you had in that culture, the more security you would have for your city. And so, though he talks about the house of the Lord and the leadership necessary therein, the sons, and the city and the protection necessary, he does end by saying, praise God for children, because that's how all of this continues. And this is why the writer ends with an emphasis on children, and, can I add this to it, an emphasis on the future. You see the word sons twice, don't you? And you see the word offspring once? But do you see the word arrows? And just the thought of an arrow going somewhere else and going further, being shot at one point and then landing somewhere else later. It's the idea of the future. And then you see this future phrase, when they speak with their enemies in the city gate. That's a future tense phrase. So the psalm ends, this poem ends with Solomon thinking about the necessity of children and the future. In the plainest of terms, hear this, First Family, on this Sanctity of Life Sunday, as we're thinking about our role as stewards, the future of houses and cities depends on the birthing and raising of children. If there's not a future generation in our homes now, there will not be a future construction of homes later. Without procreation, we won't have a population. There will be nobody to house or to govern. So let's make no mistake. Children matter. Solomon was aware that what lay at the root of all good spiritual communities and physical communities, the house and the city, was a solid family community. And I'm more convinced than ever that the foundation for the future of any community, whether it be the spiritual one or the physical one, it rests in the rocking chairs and backyards of our current homes. Kids matter. They're a reward. They're a treasure. I was hearing this week of a story of one of our dads. I heard this secondhand. It's true. It's a beautiful story of how a father is just training his kids. They left small group. I'm not sure what week. It may have been a few weeks ago, but it was recent. And their daughter was the child care worker for their small group. So I think each family chips in a small amount. I think she had like $15 or $20 when she left that night. And as they left, on their way home, they encountered someone with a financial need. I suspect it may have been someone on the side of the road, or maybe with a sign, or maybe it was just someone they met at a quick trip or a come and go or something like that. I'm not sure, but it was someone with a need who needed some money right there. Anyway, and so I think the father was either going to help or couldn't help because he didn't have cash or something, but he ended up asking his daughter, "Do you want to help?" And she said, "Oh, I'll do more than help. Here's everything I got. I'll just give everything I earned tonight." And with no problem at all, she handed over the full amount. And as the story was relayed to me, she understood something. She had no problem relaying that, handing it over, because she said, "Well, my dad's right here. He'll take care of me. I can give up my money because I've got his." Now, you laugh at that, but that's actually what she's thinking. Like, well, I'll just give all I've got because he's got me. And then this person said to me, "Don't you wish we gave that way? Don't you wish we had a close enough confidence in our God that we would say, yeah, my hands are loose. You can have anything I got, God. Have it all because you're going to take care of me." I mean, that's just a beautiful story of a father and a daughter really relating well, teaching well, teachable moments, and understanding this is what stewardship is. And it's not just that you give something up. She so willingly offered it because she trusted her dad. That gets to the root of stewardship, doesn't it? So as I think about that parent-child moment, my heart is humbled, but it's overjoyed that that's happening in our body. That's just one example of the various pockets where parents are owning their responsibility to steward their children well. And this is why in this psalm there is a case made, a strong biblical case made for seeing our children as a gift from the Lord who impact the future. And so here's what we do. We value the arrow. That's the metaphor used for children here. We fashion the arrow and we launch the arrow. That has to be what the writer here, Solomon, is thinking. He uses the word arrow on purpose. An arrow is not just a happenstance, coincidence, like I'll just pick this stick and see how well it does. No archer takes a piece of wood and just puts it in the bow as is. There's a fashioning to make sure it gets the best trajectory. It lands in the intended target. So there's time. I mean, do you love the metaphor of an arrow? I do. And that's why I like the word fashion, because it's a time-consuming process with our children to mold them, to raise them according to their bent, as Proverbs says. To know that each one is individual, and yet to try to be just and fair across the board. Can every parent here say, that's impossible? Amen, I appreciate it, right? But this is what Solomon's after. Here's the arrows in your quiver as a parent. You don't own them, you're raising them, and you're going to launch them. So value them, they're treasures, that's the heritage. Fashion them so they really are aimed well and they hit the target, and then launch them. This is the metaphor of the psalm. And if I can be just this frank with you, and I think this is true, even though we don't say it much, the upcoming cities and churches depend on it. That's why he ends with this emphasis on children and sons and daughters. Why? Because if we don't have the right kinds of sons and daughters being launched from our bows, the future spiritual communities, the future physical communities, your cities and our churches, they won't be what God needs them to be. May we steward our children well. I think one thing, lastly, in this psalm contextually that I love is the way he talks about launching these children. You don't sense for a moment that Solomon's thinking, well, we'll just see what happens. Like, I'll pull the string back and okay, good luck. He is fully expecting these arrows to land where? At the city gate, and there's an unashamed confidence with these kids that they're speaking with the enemies, which says to me there's some kind of opposition going on, right? Some of you are afraid to say it and admit it, but this is what the text says. Just get behind it, get up under it, okay? There's some kind of opposition in play, but the city these kids were raised in is still thriving. It still exists, but it's in the middle of conflict of some type. But these kids who were launched out of this man's bow, these arrows, they landed, and man, they're speaking without any timidity. They're not ashamed at all to speak with their enemies in the city gate. I love that. It's this expectancy, like, hey kids, we're going to raise you. You don't belong to us. We just simply steward you. But when you leave, you're going to live for Jesus. You're going to serve God. You're going to give your life to His purposes. It may be in all kinds of occupations. It may be in all kinds of cities. But you're going to live out God's purposes in the unique way He's wired you and gifted you. We're confident of that. So here we go. That's the sense of the text. That's why I think I'm very comfortable with the idea of a generational manager. Because whether you choose spiritual communities, the idea of a house, or physical communities, the idea of a city, or even families, something is seen in this text to continue on and on. And that's what we're stewarding. We're launching the current generation as arrows so that then they can land and launch the next generation as arrows. And we're all just waiting our time to pick up a bow and pull the string back and launch the next generation. And so we're all at different times stewarding the next generation. That's what a steward is. It's a generational manager. But this text finishes the take-home truth for us by showing us, and let's put this under our feet now, okay? That stewards are generational managers who value, fashion, and launch their children expectantly. I think this is the most honest way I can relay the chapter to you contextually and historically. I didn't want to twist it or massage it or lighten it for our culture. I want to let it speak in all of its raw reality. This is what parents are doing. We're managing and stewarding the next generation. And so knowing that, we want to value them, fashion them, and then launch them with confidence, expectantly, so that they can then continue that same thing, raising up generations of kids who will carry on God's purposes wherever they live and in whatever they do. So will you say this with me? Especially moms and dads in this room. Can we say this together? Stewards are generational managers who value, fashion, and launch their children expectantly. So we've summarized 3 activities that have some potential anxiety, but the antidote is to make sure we know that the Lord owns them all. Here we've kind of contextualized, we've seen really what the writer meant when he wrote this psalm and the importance that children have, the fundamental foundational importance they have to both spiritual and physical communities. Can we personalize this now as we close? And you will be glad to hear this. I've got a ton to say on personalizing this chapter. And I do most of it on the Extra Point Podcast Tuesday. Oh, is that good for you? So be sure to listen in. This is probably one of my favorite subjects. Family and children. I love that subject. And so I realized, about Wednesday afternoon, I'll be here past lunch in the first service. And so I did a good bit of our recording for Tuesday already. And so I want to invite you to make sure you listen to the Extra Point Podcast Tuesday. I do want to give you one nugget to whet your appetite. How you can value, launch, and fashion your arrows expectantly. I'll give you this nugget. Hopefully it will kind of lean you into making sure you take some time Tuesday. It's a little longer than normal and a little controversial in places. Here's the nugget to get you pointed in that direction. That we value, fashion, and launch expectantly when we value, fashion, and launch vertically. Say the word with me, vertically. In other words, if you can't do it without the Lord, which is what verse 1 says, right? You can't build a house, protect the city, even produce kids without the Lord. You can't do it. If you can't do it, guess what? They can't either. There's not a generational exception here. So we have to consistently, repeatedly, in an ongoing fashion, point our kids to the Lord. Every generation must do this. Every generation must know that Psalm 127:1 applies to them. You can't do this without God. You can do it without the club, the sports team, the class, the group. There's a lot of things you can do that without their approval. Does that make sense? You cannot do this without the Lord. But often we switch that. And we make everything but the Lord seem like it's more important. I addressed this on Tuesday as well. And sometimes we wonder why our generations stray. I want to encourage you with this general statement that if you want to value, fashion, and launch the generation under your roof expectantly, then you must do this vertically. You must be in a constant posture of pointing them to Jesus with great confidence and courage and with no shame or timidity. Let me give you an example of this. Right from the Bible. It happened just before Moses passed away. God had told him he was going to die, that he would not see the land, but he was to prepare the people to see the land. And so that's how Deuteronomy opens. And so to prepare them for the land, he repeats the law to them. Deuteronomy simply means a second law, the second giving of the law. That's what the whole book is. As he begins to do that, listen to how he starts. You'll recognize this passage in Deuteronomy 6. This is how he's prepping the people, the next generation, for their next leader and for his departure. This is what he's saying to them. Verse 7, Deuteronomy 6. He says, this is verse 6 actually. These words that I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. The word heart there would refer to the center of someone's being. It's everything about a person. This is the seat of that. This is the seat of that. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. I think that's everything you're doing. You're either sitting, standing, walking, or lying down. There's no area that you shouldn't talk about the Lord to your kids. Amen. That's why he says repeat. I love the way Moses owns it. It's like, hey, you're going to just have to repeat this over and over and over and over. Like, that's what your job is. Talk about this all the time. He says, bind them as a sign on your hand and let them be a symbol on your forehead. That means they're very visible. So you catch what's happening here? Moses said, make sure it's so audible, they never forget it, and make sure it's so visible, they always see it. Now, did he mean they actually should do it? Maybe, maybe not. Some of the Jewish culture, they did. They created ways to bind these things on their wrists, on their forehead. They even, as the next part says, write them on the doorpost of your house. When I visited Israel, there's these little containers they'd put on the doorpost of Jewish homes, and inside were these verses, the Shema. So they put them on the doorpost. So they would take these literally. Fantastic. I think the bigger point is every part of your life needs to communicate and reverberate. God is the reason we're here. You belong to Him. And we're going to release you one day to live your life for Him. Now, verse 20, there's an interesting phrase. Moses says, when your son asks you in the future. Isn't that good? You see, this is a common thread here. When your son asks you in the future, what's the meaning of the decrees and statutes and ordinances that the Lord our God has commanded you? You tell him this. We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand. Before our eyes, the Lord inflicted great and devastating signs and wonders on Egypt, on Pharaoh, and on all his household. But He brought us from there in order to lead us in and give us the land that He swore to our ancestors. And God did that. Joshua shows they were given the land. Verse 24, the Lord commanded us to follow all these statutes and to fear the Lord our God for our prosperity always and for our preservation as it is today. That whole answer is a vertical, it's all about God. It's really Moses' testimony on behalf of God's people. So when I say to you, if you want to value, fashion, and launch what God has entrusted to you and your family, your children, if you want to do that expectantly, do it vertically. I'm just simply saying this. Testify about God's work all the time. Like some of you are really glad the Chiefs won yesterday. And you've told your kids about that already. Have you told your kids about what God has done for you? I'm not trying to say you shouldn't talk football, but I would say to you, if you talk football more than God, maybe you should analyze your conversation trends. And you can put any subject you want in there. Moses here is an example of what it looks like to value, fashion, and launch expectantly. It means to do it in vertical fashion where we are testifying about God's work, God's grace among us all the time. We credit Him. We don't take any of the glory. It's by His grace. And we praise Him. We extol Him. We exalt Him. You make that your regular practice. Here's what will happen. That arrow will land confidently, unashamedly, without any timidity, right where it needs to land, and they will speak with their enemies in the city gate courageously. And God's purposes will live on. His church will carry on. Cities will flourish. And I want to encourage you, just as you are stewarding your children, just as you are trying to value and fashion and launch them, teach them to do the same so that when it's their turn, they will steward and manage that generation. For every parent is a generational manager, a steward of the children God has given us.